in the region and locally and immediately, persistent loss of revenue for Egypt is going to potentially lead to social instability. And social instability in Egypt has ripples which go throughout not just North Africa, but potentially the whole continent.
In a direct response to the conflict happening in Gaza, we saw another conflict that mushroomed in the Red Sea. And on 19 October last year, Houthi rebels started attacking vessels in the region. Now, the group claimed that, it was mainly targeting Israeli vessels. However, there have been some reports of vessels being attacked with no apparent link to Israel. And in retaliation of this, we saw the West launch a full-scale attack on the group in the region. And this has been ongoing, and the conflict is really at a difficult stage at this point. And we know that the conflict has a devastating impact on arguably what's the most important trade route in the world. But specifically focusing on the impact this conflict has on Africa, I'm joined now by Mr. Timothy Walker. He is a maritime project leader as well as a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. Tim, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, Ilse-Marie. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we understand the global impact this conflict is going to have. Most likely the inflationary pressures that's going to come from this. And it's funny because it's coming at a time where everyone is kind of tracking what's happening with inflation to pinpoint when interest rates are going to come down. But I would like to just for one moment, because we're focusing on Africa, to stand still at Egypt specifically, because we know Egypt is facing its worst economic crisis in years. It's already an IMF bailout program. The conflict in Gaza is literally happening at its doorstep. And now it's losing out on revenues that they used to get from vehicles and ships and vessels moving through the Suez Canal, but it's now being stopped because no one is going through the Red Sea. The thing, Tim, that I find very interesting about this is that Egypt is surprisingly very quiet on the matter.
You're absolutely right. That takes a lot of people aback at trying to understand why Egypt isn't more forthcoming or present in either negotiations, pressing for a ceasefire, or indeed naval patrols in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. It's important to just stress that there are still ships going through the Red Sea. The targeting by the Houthis of ships is pretty, how do I put it? The targeting
random?
of ships, but yes, indeed random. A little bit. The kind of intelligence that they've been gathering, it seems, on who owns the ships and who operates them is not very in depth. There's seldom been actually a genuine link between who they claim they're attacking or the reasons why and the actual victim. And that's largely due to the kind of opaque nature of shipping, where flags of convenience or the owner and the charterer, they're located in several different countries, and you have shell companies sometimes involved. So to actually then say that by attacking this vessel, we are definitely having a strategic effect on either Israel's war in Gaza or the choice of the US or UK to counterattack is very tenuous to make. What it is having a strategic effect on, though, as you say, is on the things which aren't as high profile at the moment, such as revenue from the Suez Canal for Egypt, and other things potentially like grain imports to East Africa going through Suez. It does have an effect. Those things really do matter. I would say one of the big reasons why Egypt has been quite reluctant is the memory, I would say, of the Arab Spring, and I think this is the case for many other Arab countries in the region. The depth of feeling for the Palestinian suffering is obviously huge, and to do something which would potentially be interpreted as helping Israel or taking the pressure off Israel by, for instance, targeting Houthis, it is likely to trigger maybe some kind of protest or demonstration of solidarity. And the fear, as I mentioned, going back to the events we saw in 2011 throughout the region, is that those kind of protests morph into larger anti-government protests. So that's, I think, one of the big things holding them back. The Egyptians are able to try various things around the Suez Canal, like, for instance, lower the rates for ships going through to make it more attractive, or as it likely has to do, though, increase the rates to cover the gap in its finances. The Suez Canal is a huge chunk of Egyptian revenue, and it's just not something they can replace very easily. But like I say, the broader kind of strategic effect of what the Houthis have done by attacking ships in the manner of which they say is actually quite clever. It has stopped neighboring countries from being too critical or even getting involved in stopping it. And it shifted the focus onto, quite successfully, the attacks ongoing in Gaza. Whether these attacks would continue when a ceasefire, hopefully a ceasefire will start, is another thing entirely, and I think it's also worth looking into.
You mentioned now, you touched on the fact that, you know, the Suez Canal is also very important for the likes of fertilizer and grain coming through the Ukraine, especially to East Africa. And we kind of want to go on with this theme of, you know, everyone is so quiet about what's happening. It's because it's not only Egypt, it's this whole region that stands to be economically impacted, and severely so, at a time when very few countries can actually afford to struggle any further. So where are the regional bodies? Where's the African Union? Should there be a voice for Africa specifically at the table for this conflict resolution, and where are they?
Yeah, the primary African voices at the moment, or the most high profile, would definitely be what's called the A3 on the Security Council. Those African states, I think it's Algeria, Mozambique, and forgive me for not remembering the third one off the top of my head. But they have been. Oh, sorry, it's Sierra Leone. Apologies to Sierra Leone listeners. Those three countries have been have contributed a great deal to the debates there, and I think it's very important that their position is consolidated or coordinated. That's happened on many international security issues over the past decade, and that's often a role undertaken by the African Union. And the African Union needs to take soundings from, in particular, its Peace and Security Council, but that has yet to convene to really discuss this. There's only so many, I suppose, meeting opportunities for the council, and having an item put onto the agenda needs to be suggested by one of the members. And it seems at the moment one of the major crisis point that it's dealing with is actually the dispute that's emerging between Ethiopia and Somalia over the memorandum of understanding that Somaliland alleges will lead to recognition of its sovereignty. That is where the regional community, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, which is called IGAD, and the African Union have dedicated some efforts. And the former Nigerian president, Obasanjo, has been appointed as a special envoy to try and mediate this. So those are the key sort of political considerations, which I think are occupying the majority of the time of African states who are able to voice perspectives or to coordinate them. Having said that, though, there are several strategic issues which they do need to consider and take into account. Food security being one that has been the subject of several African Union debates and communiques and resolutions. That is something which last year, if people recall, when there was a grain deal between Ukraine and Russia, mediated by the United Nations to export Ukrainian grain without it being sort of attacked. When Russia moved to and then eventually left the deal, there was a lot of concern that would lead to food insecurity in East Africa. Now, the grain can continue to come through, but it just raises the questions of, well, if there's an increased price for doing that, or there's more risk of potentially disruptions or congestion, then that will cause food insecurity too. So we do need to, I think, take a broader view of this conflict.
What's happening, obviously, because the Suez Canal is now, not the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, it's blocked there. A lot of ships are choosing not to go through anymore. We see them obviously rerouting around Africa. And bear with me, because we are in South Africa and we understand that our ports aren't exactly in pristine operational order at the moment, you know, regardless, even before all this traffic. But surely that's not a problem that's, you know, unique to South Africa. You know, ports that might not be able to handle the traffic, and My guess is then that because of the added traffic, there will also be an increased risks with all this extra traffic coming around Africa now.
Yes. Safety of navigation at sea has to be the number one priority. Safety of life is one of those universal principles. You know, if a ship is sinking, 99.9% of the time, fellow ships and seafarers in the region will come to that ship's aid, because they realize that safety has to be crucial. But the more ships you have clustering in an area, and the Red Sea being a very good example of a bottleneck where it's very, very narrow, so everybody has to basically wait their turn and queue sometimes. You see this with the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal as well. It means that there is an increased risk of things like collisions, increased risk maybe of piracy in some cases, where in the Indian Ocean, you could have a clustering of vessels waiting for their owners or their charterers to decide whether to go through the Red Sea, and for instance, maybe doing their due diligence on links to Israel, and that presents sometimes a sort of a kind of a hunting ground, if I put it that way, for pirates. Who there are several pirate groups now in operation off Somalia, and they have a hijacked vessel. They're already, now that's only one, and it's not necessarily going to spread further south. But if ships are going to have to take the longer route for a longer time, they're going to need adequate fuel. They're going to need it at a price which makes it feasible for them to always be considering South Africa. And unfortunately, we're not quite in that position. We do have good bunkering facilities in Durban and Cape Town, and companies based in places like Richards Bay who are going to obviously play a very increasingly important role in global shipping. The price of bunkering fuel in South Africa is higher than most other places of the world where ships would usually refuel. A good example being Singapore. Most ships would try and fuel as much as they can, maybe to avoid having the extra cost.
Why is that? Sorry to interrupt you. Why? Why is South Africa's fuel more expensive?
It's largely down to kind of an intersection of geography and manufacturing or facilities. We don't have many refineries in this part of the world, so we have to import basically fuel or parts of the fuel, which we then combine or make available. And the added distance of reaching South Africa from places where that happens means that there's an extra cost to add on to the fuel that we then want to sell on. And there's been several issues in Algoa Bay, where SARS have declared a kind of a moratorium on offshore bunkering. So most ships would, as you pointed out, would like to go into places like Durban or Cape Town, but the congestion could be very bad there. So actually, most of the time they'd like to refuel offshore. So there will be a vessel which they can draw alongside and take on the fuel that they need. Sometimes that's dangerous. It can lead to spills, and that has happened. But most of the time, that is how most of ships get refueled, and that's not something that's able to happen at the moment because of a dispute over the revenue and the classification of bunkering fuel and the payment of customs. So unfortunately, I wouldn't say we've shot ourselves in the foot, but there's an external event, the crisis in the Red Sea, which has basically made South Africa more of a strategic priority or a center, but we don't necessarily have our complete facilities available to do something about that. And if we do get our ports less congested, have as much fuel as shipping needs coming around, it might be too late by the time we actually get the plan right. For instance, there might be a ceasefire in Gaza, and I think it's actually important to just focus on whether the Houthis would stop or not if there were to be a ceasefire. They've made the connection between Gaza and their activities very clear, but they
do come across as a group trying to exploit the situation, in the middle of a perfect storm.
Yes, their history suggests that they are a group who actually benefit from creating maritime insecurity. They were subject to a naval blockade for several years by a Saudi-led coalition who had been trying basically to do what the Americans are doing now and the UK are doing now, to remove them from power, to degrade their capabilities. But they survived. They actually can, in effect, be said to have emerged triumphant from that, because they are still there and actually able to continue attacking ships if they want. So they've developed drones, they developed uncrewed vessels, which are remotely operated, sort of remote controlled, with explosives on board. They've developed a whole suite of capabilities which are designed to either attack or disrupt shipping, or to violate UN sanctions, to import arms from partner countries, most notoriously Iran, who are providing some capabilities and capacity to them. So they actually thrive in a situation, and they gain leverage in, for instance, negotiations with the Saudi-led coalition with Saudi Arabia at the moment to secure more recognition or legitimacy as potentially a state in themselves. And what you've seen as well in the streets of Sana'a and other places in Yemen is the successful utilization of the attacks as a sign of, to kind of harness public anger at this and leverage it into support, or to become seen as the domestic support and actually the guardian or the leader at the domestic level. So there's a lot that the Houthi gain from these attacks, which isn't in any way linked to what happens in Gaza. And it's actually very interesting to think that because they have attacked shipping before, and missiles and drones, it's likely that could continue, because they realize that they gain a tremendous amount of benefit, strategic benefit, in terms of relations with other countries, prominence, and that they actually can close shipping down in the Red Sea, or really, really make it a problem to sail through there. That's why I think
they want to be seen maybe as the power that has the ability to strong arm the West.
So the Houthis are quite well ensconced in the area. They've got domestic support. They've got facilities for creating very cheap weapons. They're effectively able to strangle a lot of world trade with sometimes off-the-shelf kind of technology, which is maybe a concern. I think a good reason why there's such a strong response by the United States and the UK is also to demonstrate that this kind of activity is not tolerated, because there are other groups around the world that might look at this and say, we are located close to shipping or somewhere where there's a lot of oil platforms, maybe. If we get hold of this kind of technology, we could do that.
That's something that you mentioned in your report, and I wanted to follow on to it, because you mentioned, the pirate attack that we saw off the coast as well. How big do you think is the threat of copycats? Copycats, like you said, now maybe targeting oil vessels, or even the piracy, maybe seeing some kind of a revival, because all of the naval security is now kind of focused on a completely different region, and it could create some gaps for pirates or rebel groups or extremists to really take advantage.
Absolutely. The studying sort of policies around security around the world over the last couple of decades reveals that if there's a lesson to be learnt from a conflict somewhere else, a group will try and copy it and adapt it to their own circumstances. So sort of terrorist attacks or smuggling techniques are copied. Insurgent groups, when they see something which works, will try and understand if they can adapt it, and if it does, they will do so. So drones, and perhaps just focusing on the drones, they do seem to be quite accessible technology. They're increasingly in operation. And if a group decides that it will invest or try and explore this avenue and then look at offshore potential targets, there are several which are not either very well protected or effectively have a huge impact if they're disrupted. I think the key one here would be what's happening in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. Now, I must just say, there's no indication that the insurgents there are planning to do this, and I hope they don't, obviously. But Mozambique is incredibly dependent on offshore gas facilities at the moment. Huge vessels, as big as the vessel which blocked the Suez Canal a few years ago, is sitting off Mozambique, generating liquefied natural gas. And the revenue from that, if insecurity on land continues, it becomes more and more important in Mozambique. If there's some kind of disruption to that through some kind of attack, that would have a huge ramification. Now, Mozambique Navy is not really in a position to do much about that, but there are many private security companies or hired security in the area, security risk companies and things like that, who do have some capabilities to provide that kind of security. Whether or not that's the kind of long-term solution to maritime security is a question we do need to focus on. But I think that's one of the key things, is to kind of almost show that attacks on shipping will be responded to robustly, and that if there is a perceived strategic benefit which should be gained from doing so, it won't last. It will actually be more costly in the long run. That's what the US and UK are trying to show, but not successfully at the moment, I would say.
What are some of your top concerns, economic concerns for Africa stemming from this conflict?
In the region and locally and immediately, persistent loss of revenue for Egypt is going to potentially lead to social instability. And social instability in Egypt has ripples which go throughout not just North Africa, but potentially the whole continent. The declaration, so for instance, if Houthi attacks continue and potentially joined up by what we see as Iranian-linked hijackings in the Straits of Hormuz, the price of oil, the cost of refining it into fuel, and the cost of everything associated with which uses that kind of petrol will increase. And sometimes it might not be a huge amount for markets elsewhere in the world or in, for instance, Europe. But here, where as you say, with inflation, the amount of value that your currency has and what you can get for it is going to only be impacted worse. The problem as well, I might just add, of potential oil spills or attacks on shipping, which leads to environmental damage, is very concerning too. We've seen a few oil tankers or product tankers attacked. Efforts to put those out have been very encouraging, but you can't really stop a ballistic missile from hitting a ship. You can stop pirates from attacking with armed guards, but if there are going to be more and more product tankers attacked, one of those is going to suffer an enormous accident eventually. And just to add as well, the Houthi and the Yemeni authorities for a long time had been negotiating about a tanker, a floating offshore vessel called the Safar, which contained 4 million barrels of oil, and that was basically held together by the rust in a way. So it was almost an environmental disaster. Now this ship is still there; it's been mostly emptied of its oil, but the replacement vessel is in the vicinity, and there is now a growing conflict around that. So, and oil spills there would not, the environmental impact would be terrible, but the effect on communities in terms of fishing, long-term projections of what we call blue economies and sustainable development, where people want to look at ocean opportunities like tourism, like fishing, and do them sustainably, but generate new jobs and wealth. That would be tremendously impacted, I think, in the whole of East Africa. And so the impacts would be short-term and regional in some respects, but they would be long-lasting too.
Last question. If you were an African representative on the UN Security Council, what will you add to the conflict resolution debate on how Africa can add to resolving this crisis?
That's a good question. If I was on the Security Council right now, I think linking the resolution of the crisis in the Red Sea to Gaza is important, but by doing that, as Algeria and Mozambique have done, and Sierra Leone has as well, but it still voted for the last resolution, which didn't include a mention of Gaza. It can potentially limit the conversation on some of these implications that we've discussed, which I do think matter, like potential for oil spills, the potential of food insecurity, insurance rates going up for crossing this area of the waters. Those are long-term issues. I think it's very important to maintain that a ceasefire in Gaza is the number one priority, but not linking the fact that a ceasefire has come into play as a result of the shipping crisis. I think they are linked in the sense that the Houthi have utilized this as a reason to gain additional leverage in the region, and no doubt some of them feel very motivated that this potentially would help. But what's coming out in the effects on the impact of the shipping attacks has been that Israel continues, and it's not actually stopping them from doing so. What it can do is heap more pressure on. But I firmly believe that what South Africa did at the ICJ over the last couple of weeks has had far more impact in doing that than attacks on shipping. That is where the key linkage is made, those kind of efforts. So drawing attention to the absolutely essential role that free and open shipping plays in global trade is the key next step for African countries to do. Again, it's not an urgent, sometimes security matter, but linking it to the fact that we have development goals, we have the free trade agreement, and trying to understand that maritime security is going to play a big role in that, and maritime security elsewhere in the world can actually impact on it. And utilizing that to ensure or get that conversation going at the African Union, as well as somewhere places like the regional communities, to have a more coordinated African maritime force or maritime agency that can track these matters, provide early warning, but also help provide solutions through recommendations.
Tim, I think it's still a difficult road ahead for anyone that's sitting on that council and anyone that's involved in the conflict resolution. But as this transpires, I'm sure I'll check in with you again. So thank you very much for joining me on Markets Magnified.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Check out some of our other conversations on YouTube. You can also find Markets Magnified on Spotify.